Hello and welcome to Chain Reaction, a podcast series examining America's role in the world. I am your host, Aaron Stein, the Director of Research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. Every 2 weeks, we will talk to experts about a variety of topics and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. After abandoning a policy of neutrality, Sweden was expected to rapidly join NATO in time for the upcoming summit in Madrid this June. Instead, Turkey, a NATO member since 1952, has blocked Sweden's accession, demanding a series of concessions ranging from support for Turkish counterterrorism operations in Syria to extraditing Swedish citizens of Kurdish origin. To discuss this issue, I am joined by Dr. Paul Levin, the director of Stockholm University's Institute for Turkish Studies. Enjoy the show. Hello and welcome. Today I'm joined by Paul Levin, the director of Stockholm University's Institute for Turkish Studies. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Paul, I thought I would have you on the show because what everybody expected would be a swift coronation for what I expect to be NATO's two newest members, Sweden and Finland, has turned into a bit of a fiasco as Turkey, one of NATO's first original enlargement member, I should say, has thrown up a veto over the accession of these two countries, perhaps risking these two countries not becoming members by the Madrid summit at the end of this month in June. Paul, could you give us a little sense about how this is playing out inside of Sweden at the moment, where you're talking to me from?
Yeah, well, at the very moment, it is quite turbulent, actually, because as of today, we're headed toward what might become a cabinet crisis in Sweden, which I can tell you more about, but where this sort of NATO issue plays a big role. It was a surprise to many here. I mean, there were some of us who had warned that this might be a possibility that Turkey might raise objections. But generally speaking, the debate was much more focused on whether or not Sweden should join NATO. I mean, for the Social Democratic government, for the Social Democratic Party, which is in government, they had to undergo a very difficult sort of internal discussion and change a long-standing policy that was sort of integral to the party's perception of itself and of Sweden's role in international affairs, abandoning, you could argue, several hundred years of as we call it, freedom from alliance, non-aligned policy. And I think the discussion was very much focused inwards. So when they finally made the decision that everybody was, expecting to turn in the application or notify NATO that it wanted to join, the parties on the right were ready to celebrate. It was a bit momentous decision for them. And the Social Democrats were sort of happy that they had made a very difficult decision, and also that this decision had been made quickly so that it would not play a role in the upcoming elections in September as well. And then all of a sudden, Erdogan comes on the very same day pretty much and pours cold water on the whole thing, and it's caused quite a bit of consternation here.
Well, I actually did want to talk to you about that because, as I understand it, the government may fall, over this. And I want to come back to that because I'm not an expert on Swedish politics, and I will reveal my ignorance over the course of this podcast. So I hope you correct me where I screw up. But let's talk about what the Turks are saying is the problem with Sweden and how that is being interpreted, sort of in the Swedish domestic context. Basically, what the Turks are saying is that Sweden is too soft on Kurdish terrorism. In its most simplest form. I believe the foreign minister and the defense minister at various times in recent Swedish history have said positive things about the Syrian Kurds, the acronym being the YPG, and that Ankara has really drawn a tough line here. Can you talk a little bit about how this is all playing out and perhaps why these diaspora politics is even playing out and is even a factor in this NATO membership to begin with?
Oh, okay. A lot of questions there. So part of the confusion here in Sweden is that the demands that have been raised, the actual concrete demands, they kind of vary from depending on who conveys them and at what time. But at the core of it is exactly what you say, that Turkey thinks that Sweden is too lax on the PKK and what it sees as the PKK Syrian branch, the YPG, and wants Sweden to cut off any ties with them. and accuses Sweden of harboring terrorists, primarily the PKK. Originally, though, it was also, the PKK, FETÖ, DHKPC, a number of different organizations that were mentioned, but it's primarily these Kurdish militia groups I think they're concerned about. So they put forth demands, pointing out that they've asked for a number of terrorist suspects in Turkey, or from the Turkish perspective, terrorist suspects who are in Sweden, and asked for them to be extradited. I think there's like a list of some 30. I don't think the list has actually been publicized, but anyway, there's some information in Swedish media about who or some of the names are on that list. And then there's a concern from Turkey that there's a Swedish arms embargo on Turkey. And I think also behind that is the fact that it's not just that Sweden has an arms embargo, but that in 2019, after one of these Turkish military operations in northeast Syria or northern Syria, Sweden was sort of a driving force behind a EU informal arms embargo as well. And then there's the issue of the YPG, this Kurdish militia in northeast Syria that is the dominant force within the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, which from the Swedish and also US, one could add, perspective is an important partner in the international coalition against ISIS, but from Turkish perspective is PKK. There are accusations from Turkey that Sweden provides them with arms and with financing, and that Sweden needs to cut all ties. So now I'm conveying the demands. I'm not evaluating right now. We can talk about each of these demands, but so that's, I think, if I'm not mistaken, if we're getting anything else right now, that along with accusations that Sweden is allowing the PKK to operate more or less freely and fundraise and organize in Sweden, those are sort of the main demands that Sweden stops all of those things.
One of the challenges, the US faces after the failed coup is that Turkey's demands for extradition, quite often don't meet the sort of higher level of evidentiary standards in I guess, Western courts. For us, this was about Fethullah Gülen. Is it the same sort of dynamic and debate that's going on now? In terms of they just can't meet the evidentiary standards, or on this extradition issue? Because for me, that's the poison pill within the entire demands. I do think that there are probably some things that the Swedish government could do on the arms embargo. There's probably some things that could be done on terror financing, but the extradition is the one that I see as particularly problematic. I don't know how you see it. No,
I think that's accurate. I think you have the same dynamic, and I think that's frankly a non-starter. And I'm not even sure that Ankara expects that demand to be met. For one thing, just to be very crude about it, a crude way of putting it is that the problem is that at Sweden, in Sweden you have the rule of law, and in Turkey you don't. And the combination makes it difficult. In Sweden, the government, I think, could not even extradite these individuals, even if they decided to, if they wanted to. It's literally up to the Supreme Court to decide. So what's happened is since 2015, Swedish courts have said no to extradition requests. There has, however, been not responses to extradition requests, but expulsions of terror suspects. So in 2020, a PKK suspect was, turned over to Turkish authorities. It's also the case that's emerged from news reports and from statements by lawyers that there are a number of Kurdish asylum seekers who have had their asylum applications denied on the basis of information from the Swedish sort of security police pertaining to, we think, the fact that they have sympathies with the PKK or even perhaps the YPG. And that seems to be sufficient reason for these asylum applications to be denied. They, however, have not been turned over to Turkish authorities. And part of the reason is that, as you say, in the extradition request, the evidence has not been very convincing. I've seen some of the names. There are a couple of Gülenists, members of this religious organization that Turkey accuses of having been behind the failed coup in 2016, probably with good reason. But the evidence against these particular individuals, I think, is rather weak. That's how it's been evaluated by Swedish courts. They're essentially journalists. And there's another very prominent Turkish leftist publisher who have published books on the Armenian genocide and Kurdish issues and those kind of things. But evidence that he would be a terrorist funder or organizer are not very convincing, to say the least. So I think that's a very weak claim of the many that have been put forth.
Well, one of them that came out, and I believe it came from the Turkish ambassador to Sweden himself, is somebody who is at like the center of this. Again, I may screw this up, so please correct me if I'm wrong. Is at the center and is perhaps a key power player in the debate that's going on in the Swedish parliament about the potential vote of no confidence in the current prime minister. And her name is Amine Kakabaveh, who I believe is an Iranian Kurd, who is now in the parliament. I believe she was part of the leftist side of the Swedish parliament, but now actually votes independent. And she's like actually the swing vote in the entirety of the parliament in terms of who stays in power. I may have screwed that up, but
no, that's entirely correct.
Yeah, and so you have a leftist government in power, and obviously in preparation for the potential elections in September, the opposition smells blood over this, and so there's a potential for the government to fall and for it to be indirectly or perhaps directly linked to what's going on over Turkey's role in stalling out this NATO accession. Can you talk a little bit about Amine and her role in all this and her potential to be extradited, or whether she's even on the list if we know?
I mean, there have been statements by both President Erdogan and then also by the Turkish ambassador to Sweden that there are parliamentarians who are terrorists. And I mean, I think they have not formally requested that she be extradited. I don't think that's the case. I think what happened was in an interview with Swedish media, he was asked the question and then responded, yes, if she has ties to the PKK, she should also be extradited or something like that. But she has been placed at the center of this whole controversy. So she made an agreement for the current government when our previous prime minister. So the current government is a minority social democratic single party government. And for them to have enough votes to secure a majority for the prime minister, Magdalena Andersson, I think this was last year, they needed to have the support of this. In Sweden, we call them wild ones. When they're independent, they're former members of the party who have left. So she left the left party, and she agreed to support the prime minister only after they made a written agreement that essentially said that the Social Democratic Party and the government, but the agreement was with the party secretary, actually, the Social Democratic Party should strengthen its collaboration and ties with the PYD, right, in Syria, which is the sort of political party, like the military branch is YPG and so on. So that has obviously become a big issue for Turkey in this whole debate. And now what's happened is, unrelated to the NATO expansion question, the far right party in Swedish parliament just announced that they would raise a vote of no confidence for one of the ministers, the Minister of Justice and the Interior, for unrelated matters. And enough opposition parties to the right have said that they would support this, that to actually put him in jeopardy. And the prime minister has responded in a very emotional way, saying that this is irresponsible now that we're in sort of a delicate negotiation over NATO expansion. There's a war in Europe, and this is not time for a crisis. And she continues the practice that her predecessor had established, namely to put the entire government on the line to protect one minister. So she said, either you support, if you convict him or fell him, then the entire government will fall. So that means that now, again, they will need the vote of this wild one, Aminika Kakabaveh, and she is saying that she will only support the government if they live up to their pledge regarding ties to this Kurdish Syrian militia, which of course comes at a tremendously inopportune time for the government as it is trying to placate Turkish concerns. So this vote, by the way, this will happen on Tuesday. So we'll see what happens.
That's really fascinating. I didn't realize that she had conditioned her support for the current party in power on strengthened ties to the PYD, and I can you can really start to connect the dots, like why the Turks are so upset about this when you start to figure this out. The problem I always have with this, and this is the piece I wrote for the War on the Rocks, is like when you step back, right? The reason I think that Sweden and Finland, but in this case we're talking about Sweden, moved away from its history of non-alignment, but tilt towards the West, right? Was
Absolutely.
because of the broader circumstances that are going on, which is the Russian invasion of Ukraine and serious concerns that if there isn't a united front, and again, you're much closer to Russia than the United States, that Moscow needs to be deterred. So is there this sort of poignant feeling? Let me ask one more question. As I understand it from my interviews, is that the expectation was, and even Turkey had privately reassured that they would quickly move on this as well. And so,
well, I don't know if the reassurance wasn't that they would move quickly, but what I had understood is that the Turkish foreign minister had conveyed to his Swedish counterpart, and also we heard the Finnish president say that Erdogan had conveyed the same thing, namely that Turkey supports the NATO's open door policy and they would support enlargement. Right. So it did come as a shock.
Yeah, that's what I've heard too, and so. I guess the question I have is there a sense of buyer's remorse amongst the Swedish domestic polity and its politicians that they've gotten themselves into this mess? Or is it just manifesting itself as sort of bewilderment or even anger at Turkey? Because I can say from the US perspective, this was a big Biden achievement and it's bubbling beneath the surface, but the US is just trying to keep it quiet. Extreme irritation about what the Turks are doing.
Yeah, I mean, so the Swedish political parties are divided on NATO and have been divided on NATO. So there's a strong tradition on the right to favor NATO membership. The Social Democrats have moved, as you say, they've moved de facto towards NATO membership, and we've increased our collaboration with NATO, tremendously. So, right now, we're almost members in all but actual formal. We don't have the security guarantees. We participate in planning meetings. We have aligned a lot of our technical systems and so on, and participate in exercises. So there's still additional steps to be taken for full membership, certainly. But so there's been this long movement, but I don't think one should underestimate, especially on the left and within the Social Democratic Party, the sort of very ideologically difficult transformation that's happened. So, you can go back to Olof Palme, the Swedish prime minister, who maybe most famous for having been assassinated, but he was sort of this strong voice, even though behind the scenes, we collaborated with the Americans and were expecting American support in case we were attacked. Publicly, Olof Palme was out and demonstrated against the Vietnam War. He walked on the Swedish streets with the North Vietnamese ambassador, much to Washington's consternation. But so this sense of Sweden as an independent voice that stands up for human rights, democracy, gender equality, it's very important. So there were a lot of voices of concern within the Social Democratic Party, and they were expressed quietly within the party. They were expressed more loudly by former members of the party, the senior former foreign policy elite that had been pursuing Swedish traditional foreign policy of non-alignment, and also by the left party. And the argument and the concern was, do we really want to join a military alliance with countries such as Turkey, for example? So the left party leader, for example, Nooshi Dadgostar, she would in debates say things such as, I don't want to send my daughters to kill Kurds on Erdogan's behalf, right? That's the kind of rhetoric. So a lot of them are now saying, "Well, we told you so," and a lot. I think there is probably a bit of a buyer's remorse within the left, the Social Democratic Party. People who say, "Yes, we came around to supporting NATO membership reluctantly, but these concerns that we had, well, the first thing that happened was Turkey is placing demands that we do sacrifice concern for minorities like the Kurds, for example. So was this really the right thing?" I do think that it's raising a lot of difficult questions, and it's placing if you want to put it bluntly, it's putting the Social Democratic government in a difficult position of choosing between sort of Swedish security and national security and values and principles. And that's an unusual choice for Swedish politicians.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating as well. A journalist asked me this yesterday, and I wasn't sure how to answer it, but I'll ask you. It's, a lot of things that you see in Turkish domestic politics, right? And the way that they frame this issue is that, the debates that you just talked about right now is that the Swedish left have said quite openly that they don't want to come to Turkey's defense. And what they're talking about is that comment about the Kurdish issue, right?
Yeah.
And of course, the Kurdish issue is not a NATO issue, but Turkey's trying to make it a NATO issue, and that's an entirely separate issue. But the way that Turks, at least in my reading, have framed this is that we're the second largest army in NATO, right? If they won't come to our defense, we won't go to their defense. So we don't want to go defend them either because they support the YPG, PKK, PYD, Kurdish alphabet soup. How is the government planning to explain this to its own people? Because again, this may not get resolved by June 28th, but it will get resolved eventually, right? Is that the country will and is signing up for a forever alliance, unless something catastrophic happens, with 30 plus other countries, some of which maybe don't share its values. And if the values are such a big part of Swedish domestic politics, as you were talking about, will this sustain political support, past the Russian invasion?
Well, I mean, that's a good discussion to be had. I'm not sure if there's like a simple answer to that. If you look at NATO's history, I'm not a NATO expert per se, but I mean, the Article 5 has been invoked only once, right? It was after 9/11, and Sweden participated in the NATO operations in Afghanistan. Sweden has participated in several operations in Libya as well. Even without being a NATO member. And I think if the question was, if Turkey is invaded by Russian forces, would Sweden then, as a NATO member, support Turkey? I think that the answer is yes. It's a little bit of a different question. If Turkey picks a fight with Kurds in Syria, would Sweden then come to Turkey's aid? That is, a bit of a different question, and it's also not an obvious question for other existing NATO members. The issue of Patriot missile systems being withdrawn by, I think, the Dutch and the Germans in response to Turkish sort of incursions. So I think that there is some leeway in NATO. It's not, you don't have to align your foreign policy entirely. There is room for difference, even though it's not unproblematic within the alliance. You can see difference between Greece and Turkey, and U.S. and Turkey, of course, on the Syrian issue, Syrian Kurdish issue. So I think there's ways to explain this to a domestic Swedish audience. It would be more difficult to explain, I think, in this making serious concessions that could be construed as abandoning values, especially when it comes to rule of law in Sweden, but also, even though there are, we've spoken about the connections with the PYD, if you look at de facto, the Turkish accusations, they're actually not correct. So the Swedish arms that Turkey claims have been found in PKK hands are, Swedish designs, but they're, I think, produced in the United States. They're not sold by Sweden. So Sweden has not provided those arms. And also, Sweden has not, as far as I'm aware, there's been no funding given to the authorities in the Autonomous Administration in Northeast Syria or the PYD. So any talks that the Social Democratic government had, I think, I'm not sure if they actually led to anything. So there have been discussions about deepening ties. I don't know if there have been concrete results. And the aid that has gone, I think there was about 10 million euros that was supposed to go to the region. It has gone to, via existing legitimate NGOs and international governmental organizations that have supported causes like, women who have been subject to gender violence and those kind of things. So it's not like if Sweden actually provides support to the YPG.
In many ways, what you're describing is the fundamental issue that NATO and the US has been dealing with Turkey since Syria started, which is Syria is out of area. It's not a NATO thing. It is not covered by Article 6 of the Washington Treaty. Exactly. It's in the wrong part of the world. And the Turks would like it to be in the right part of the world, but it just isn't. And if it was to be in that right part of the world, it would actually divide the alliance. And so the alliance doesn't want to talk about it. And that's really what the whole, Sweden is just dealing with the headwinds that we've all been dealing with as a broader member of the Western Alliance since Syria began. This is my
and the fact that Turkey, Turkey has tried to make raise the issue at the previous occasions, like in 2019, with the NATO plans to shore up defenses in the Baltics and Poland and so on. But it has less leverage but now Turkey has a lot of leverage.
Correct.
So.
Correct. The closest people keep bringing up the Rasmussen debate of 2009 is that, I don't think the Rasmussen sort of the Turkish initial veto of Rasmussen as Secretary General is the right way to think about it. I think the much closer one to look about it is the 2019 debate, which is what you just said, which is the graduated response plans. And what Turkey did there was it refused to acquiesce to the Baltic unless
for a while.
Well, there was a backstory about how that one got resolved. It ultimately got resolved, but it ultimately tied its own defense plan, which is the southern flank, to the northern flank, right? And so it wanted to get concessions on listing the YPG as a terrorist organization as part of the graduated response plan, which didn't happen, but through bureaucratic might rather than, I would say, consensus.
And then also, in response to that, sorry to drag it up, but shortly after that, if my chronology is not off, Turkey decided to take matters into its own hands and they enter into Syria. Which my chronology is that followed, the fact that Turkey did not get what it wanted.
They're all mixed in together. That's exactly right. When Turkey doesn't get what it wants and it sort of runs out of rope, it usually ends up with some incursion, invasion, or operation. Depending on where you stand in Turkish politics, you use one of those words.
Exactly, a special military operation. Right. And right now that is another specter that's looming. And I think one interpretation right now, whether that was the original plan or not, it's quite possible that Ankara is now holding this veto as leverage in getting other NATO countries and Sweden to acquiesce into its next incursion.
Correct, and that incursion could be, I would expect, if all goes to plan. The Russians come to Turkey on June 8th, right? So it's in 5 days from when we're recording this. They have a subsequent follow-on meeting with the Astana trio, which is the Iranians, the Russians, and themselves. Areas that Turkey has Erdogan himself has signaled as the places of likely incursion or invasion have Russian and regime soldiers in them. So if there's going to be a further expansion of Turkish operation in Syria, there's going to have to be something worked out with the Russians. And so the question is over these next two meetings, particularly in the bilateral space on June 8th, will there be some sort of penciled in agreement that then gets formalized at the ostensible, three guarantor powers of the trio, Iran, Turkey, and Russia, for, say, an operation in Manbij and Tel Rifat, these two little towns west of the Euphrates River. We'll see, and what will be the secondary repercussions of that, but you can see a timing that basically has an invasion or very close to invasion right at this time of the NATO summit, right? At June 28th, 29th, June 30th, this would be very sort of poetic. And then Ankara is essentially will be daring the NATO members to condemn it again, right?
Yeah.
Are you going to condemn us again, or are you going to give us solidarity? Because we need solidarity to let in these two new members. They're really turning the screws, and they do have leverage. And you're entirely right about this. It is different than the graduated response plans in that respect. let me ask you one last question, and I know it's getting to be happy hour time in Sweden, so I want to let you go. I saw this floating around Twitter, and I don't know if it's true. If you step back, Swedes aren't really asking for a Turkish security guarantee; they're asking for an American security guarantee via NATO. Is that how it's going? Is that how people are actually thinking about it, or like, is it really actually thought of as collective? I.e., we're buying into a collective organization, or is it seen as a vehicle for a U.S. security guarantee because of the fact that the U.S. guarantees the security of the alliance and what many people would argue would be Europe?
I'm not sure people have thought this through. I mean, if you do a vox pop and ask people on the street, my guess is that the assumption is that NATO membership would mean that the United States would come to the rescue, much like I think the Swedish decision-making elite has had the hope that Biden will come to Sweden's rescue in these negotiations with Turkey, which I'm a bit more skeptical about. But I'll give you a personal anecdote. I mean, this morning I live so that I can see the outlet or inlet into the Baltic Sea. And right now, there's a whole range of warships, NATO warships present here. And there were, I think there was a Dutch one that sailed by this morning and so on. So, I mean, that gave a sense of security, frankly. It's not that we perceive an urgent threat from Russia, but there is this feeling that we have now, we've shown our cards. That we are no longer non-aligned, we're no longer neutral, we're aligning with the West, we're providing weapons to the Ukraine, we've come out against Putin and Russia, and we are at this moment quite vulnerable because we lack security guarantees. And it'd be nice to sort of be welcomed into an alliance where you have 30 member states or 32 who would back you up if something happens. But I don't think that there is a lot of discussion also about the mutuality of the collective defense sort of mechanism. I mean, there is I sometimes wonder about the Swedish debate, which has been quite self-centered, focused on what Sweden can get out of NATO membership, whether it be support from other NATO members or the United States. And I think the idea has been, I mean, a lot of focus has been on the US, but perhaps less discussion about what it would mean and what would Sweden have to contribute. So, but that's about the public discussion. In reality, Sweden is already deeply aligned with NATO. It has participated in most NATO actions and is sort of already an active participant in these transatlantic, Euro-Atlantic sort of defense structures.
As I understand it, as of today, is that the Biden administration wants to keep this a bilateral issue between Sweden and Turkey. Because if the U.S. were to come, quote unquote, save the day, it becomes a venue for even larger pools of grievance, right? And so it could be delayed even further. And the U.S. can't make concessions on Sweden's behalf. We can't guarantee to Turkey that some of their demands can be met. And so it's not really our place. But what I think the Biden administration wants to do and will do is more of those sail-arounds of allies, in lieu of formal accession, is that you'll just start seeing a lot more allied and U.S. presence in Sweden and Finland until this issue is resolved. And that's my final point here is we've drawn an artificial date of June 28th. And in that respect, the Turks are right. It doesn't have to be June 28th. It can be June 28th, 2023. But I think we can both agree that this ends in membership. It may just be a little bit bumpier to get there.
I would come out as a supporter of Swedish NATO membership, so that would make me happy. I have to say right now, I'm a little bit skeptical. I mean, I don't see an immediate resolution to this issue, but I'm hoping you're right, Aaron, that down the line we'll resolve it.
I'll just say that at first, like when Erdogan first said this, there's always this sort of like arc to how we judge Erdogan. First, it's like, oh, it's just Erdogan. He's a hothead. He was just spouting off, and Cullen will come in, and Ibrahim Cullen will come in and fix it. And then it's like he says it again, and then people are like, oh, that's just for domestic political reasons. He has to shore up his right-wing flank. He is dealing with high inflation and unemployment, and he has elections in 2023. So like he'll cave once this goes off the front. And then it just keeps on dragging. And then ultimately, like the irritation with Turkey grows. And then it's like, well, he was serious the first time he said it, and so like we didn't have to go through that arc. That's always my way in dealing with the Turks, or really any right-wing populist, is they usually mean what they say. And so you better grapple with reality and try and manage it. So I guess we'll see how it turns out. We'll see how it turns out.
And let's not forget that, you mentioned there are elections, perhaps in June 23 in Turkey, but there's increasing speculation in Turkey now, but there will be new elections, early elections, and maybe in the fall. It's a common theme of speculation in Turkey, but apparently now the opposition seems to be more convinced. And the outcome is not certain for a change. So who knows what will happen?
Who knows? On early elections in Turkey, they sort of have to happen for me to believe it, but that doesn't mean that I don't believe it. Anything's possible in Turkey. That's one of the reasons why I like following that country. But I think we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining on a Friday in the evening. And thank you for putting up with my daughter in the background. She just didn't want to stay with my wife. So thank you to the listeners for putting up with some background noise. I appreciate it.
That was a delight.
And have a good rest of the day.
Be sure to subscribe to Chain Reaction on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts to be notified about new episodes. To explore more from the Foreign Policy Research Institute's research, podcasts, and upcoming events, please visit us on www.fpri.org.